We are
right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Sci-Fi show that comes out every Friday, looking at the kind of intersections between sci-fi, between psychoanalysis in general, psychotherapy, and politics. And we're really happy to be joined today by two guests on one screen. That's the first time we've had that, Elliot.
That's the format change.
And we're joined by Ian Parker and by Christian Dunker. Ian is a psychotherapist and writer from the UK, lives in Manchester, author of an enormous number of books, including recently Psychoanalysis and Revolution with 1968 Press. And Christian is a professor in psychotherapy at the University of Sao Paulo, as well as a practicing psychotherapist, psychoanalyst. And they are both part of movements. We're going to talk about this new movement, the Red Clinic, which has been established in London and which Ian is part of. And Christian is part of comparable movements in South America to think about psychoanalysis as the ally of radical politics and as accessible for all and as part of a radical political agenda rather than something sort of just for the elites or just for the middle class, as it were. So thanks for joining us, guys. Hi. And why don't you start by sort of telling us about these projects and what you're sort of hoping to achieve with them? As I understand it, the Red Clinic's fairly new, whereas Christian, what you've been doing has been going on for some time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The Red Clinic is something that tries to bring together two aspects of our practice. One is the clinical work, the ways in which we provide a space for people to speak about distress. And that might be using psychoanalysis, or it might be using other kinds of psychotherapy, depending on the people who are involved. So there's the clinical work on the one hand, and the other is the radical project, to think about questions of Marxism, feminism, post-colonial theory, and to work through what that possible connection is between the red aspect and the clinical aspect. And of course, there are two traps that we have to be careful about avoiding. One is to psychologize politics. We don't want to turn politics into some gigantic psychotherapy and to tell political activists that they should be doing psychotherapy instead. And the other trap is that we don't want to inject our politics directly into the clinic and tell people that they should be communists and that they'll be happier if they're communists. So we have to keep the two aspects separate as practices. But the Red Clinic is an institutional form to try and think about what the possible connections are between those two things. So it's a project that is radical, and it's also, I think, another key aspect is that it's internationalist. So we're making links with colleagues in other places, India, Taiwan, Palestine, Slovenia. Those people are starting to become involved in the Red Clinic, and we're also learning from similar initiatives that have been going on for many, many years in Brazil. And that's where Chris Dunker is so important as a figure that we can learn from in the practice of doing radical clinical work.
Great. So Chris, we'd actually probably need to know this. What's the status of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in Brazil? Give us the real basics as well. Is it very popular and is it common? Tell us that history. That's really interesting.
Yeah. The history starts with a dictatorship in Brazil during the 60s, when the state decided to invest in psychology instead of philosophy, social sciences, and political issues, because they considered this kind of thing too much subversive. So the country was inflated by courses and more courses of psychology. But instead of being only conservative psychology, Brazil develops a kind of resistance against the dictatorship from radical lines of psychology and social psychology and also in psychoanalysis, especially because we were influenced by Argentinian who were escaping from the dictatorship in Argentina those days. But 4 decades after that, we have psychoanalysis in high doses and cultural and debates, public debates, in hospitals and educational and so on. From that, I would say, starts to spread many nets of listening and giving support to people from universities and from psychoanalytical and psychotherapeutic societies. But from 5 years to now, there's another chapter in this history when people decide to go to public spaces like streets, even in small cities, inland Brazil, and offer a kind of public listening to the suffering of the people. And this begins a kind of a social movement with no leader, no institutional commanding the experience, but it takes all over Brazil, from big cities to small cities, from upper class to lower class, and it's very interesting what is going on now in Brazil. I don't know what's going to happen because we have lots of problems with this experience. Is it psychoanalytic or is it psychotherapy? Is it psychotherapy or is it just a kind of a listening? But the experience is going on now, and we have to think about it, and that's why I'm with you again.
Well, it sounds like
we've been together for over 20 years now, and I think it's through Chris that I learned that it's possible to actually make a direct link between psychoanalytic work and radical politics, which is something that is been difficult to make here in the English-speaking world.
That sounds like group therapy, Christian. Is it like, are you talking like outdoor group therapy? That's what came to mind for me. But or is this like a public space, or is it like a therapy? Like what?
No, it's individual. It's individual, and its symbol. Right. One of its symbols is a chair, a beach chair. You have this. You bring a beach chair to a market or to a plaza, and you stand there and you put a sign saying, "We listen to people," or psychotherapy. And someone who's passing through the road or through the street sit down and speak individually for an hour, and the next Saturday. The same psychotherapist is again over there, and you can go again and speak and continue your spoken experience. And sometimes they go to a consulting room. Sometimes they go after some encounters to a hospital, or they simply stay in the public space, listening in an analytical way. To that particular person.
I mean, it sounds completely crazy, doesn't it?
It does.
But actually,
it
links back with part of the radical history of psychoanalysis. You know, if you think about Elizabeth Danto's book, Freud's Free Clinics, she describes similar initiatives in Budapest and Berlin and Vienna, where the psychoanalysts had a commitment to make psychoanalysis available to working people, to provide that treatment free. And Freud himself gave a talk in 1918 in Budapest, where he promoted this idea that psychoanalysis should be available for people on what would be the equivalent of a national health service. And Elizabeth Danto has been to Brazil and has been talking to the psychoanalysts there to bring alive this history again. It's a history that has been cut by the rise of fascism and the adaptation of psychoanalysis to the societies that they fled to in diaspora after the Second World War. But this makes this link again, and is finding a different way of making the link in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of spaces is really important there, as well. I mean, you mentioned it has in hospitals. I mean, perhaps Ian and Eliot, you probably know better than me, but this was one of the things that we were talking about with Jameson Webster. She was sort of saying it's a shame that psychoanalysis in the UK and US doesn't have a central role in hospitals, and it always takes the form of this kind of private spaces, and it's very much not public, and it's very much I suppose that brings in the question of class and affordability that Ian, you were just talking about, and like why only select groups access and engage with psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, generally speaking. Whereas this idea of spaces like public spaces, hospitals, whatever, seems a crucial point of creating a social movement around it, maybe, or thinking about the political, social effects of or role of talking therapies, I guess. Would you say that's a question that's been is that something the Red Clinic is thinking about?
I think that's right. I mean, it's one of the central initiatives of the Red Clinic that's been developed over the last year, which is that we want to provide low cost or free psychotherapy. So we want to break out of the middle class circles that psychoanalysis is part of, and to be able to offer this and to make it available to people. Now, that doesn't mean that we compete with the National Health Service. We're able to campaign for psychotherapy to be available to people on the National Health Service as well. But the Red Clinic is a way of putting more pressure and making psychotherapy available. Now, of course, there's a different context here, which is that in Brazil, as Chris has said, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is much more widespread. You'll read about psychoanalysis in your daily newspaper. You'll hear psychoanalysts talk on the television. And so psychoanalytic ideas and psychoanalytic discourse are around in the public sphere. That's different from here in Britain, where it's a more kind of elite middle class discourse. And the other difference is that radical politics is much more evident. You know, there's a stronger communist and socialist movement in Brazil, even in these times of Bolsonaro, and many psychoanalysts are involved in the protests against Bolsonaro. So there's that link is being made in that context. Again, very different from Britain. Sorry, Eliot, go on.
Oh, no, well, the one thing I wanted to add to this kind of middle-class discourse is I'm finding I have lots of working class clients. They have very pressed incomes. They budget the therapy sessions, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. This is becoming, I think, more common. This is usually this is happening with, I think, a lot of people in their 20s, like early mid-20s. I'm seeing this a lot. I have not an insignificant amount of clients that are doing this, and some are even putting they're like, transitioning jobs, I have to put it on pause for this, and then I'll rebudget here, right? And I have like a sliding scale, of course, but this is the situation. So there are people. I think it is going outside of it is going outside of the middle class. However, like you said, I mean, to provide it for free or a very low cost would be ideal, so people don't have to do this kind of budgeting thing, and it's not such a press on people.
Yeah, I think people like you and people like us have been working in this informal way with a sliding scale for many years. And the Red Clinic is a way of extending that and giving institutional form to that, so that we can subsidize work with people who can't pay. We can subsidize that through other work that we do with people who can afford the psychoanalysis. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, my question was going back to this question of, I guess this point about Brazilian left politics, Christian, but it's a can also be a question for all of us, I suppose. I was wondering whether, I suppose, is there a psychoanalytic right, or is there, because clearly there is a psychoanalytic left, and we're talking about, So I'm intrigued by this. I mean, on the one hand, we are part of, broadly speaking, a network of sort of socialists or people who consider themselves on the left, and psychoanalysis clearly plays a role in the discourses of the left. What I would love to hear about is that kind of history, both in Brazil and elsewhere. Like, there is this radical history of psychoanalysis, but is there also another side of this? And
yes,
Brazil is a very good example. Yeah.
Yes, we have, for example, psychoanalysts that works with torturists as physicians. They worked in torture operations. And
dictatorship.
Dictatorship. And today there's a strong movement against this, arguing that psychoanalysis, as a psychoanalyst, shouldn't say and talk about politics, because this will bring bad influences to the treatment. It will collapse transference, it will broke neutrality and things like that. But it's becoming more and more popular. One of the ideas of Ian, that there is a kind of a class struggle within psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis couldn't be taken as a kind of a homogeneous movement and theorization. And this clash in psychoanalysis must be considered in epistemological and ethical terms. For example, now we have some candidates to political as deputies. They are psychoanalysts, and they are turning into institutional representation of this idea into Brazilian actual politic moment. It's very bad. We have a fascist president in charge, and these accelerates the process of becoming psychoanalysis more and more public, and breaking the psychoanalysis as a elite clinic for elite persons. And we have a question or a problem, because those initiatives needs more and more formation or training devices to persist. Otherwise, the question about money and the sustainability of this experience couldn't be applied to working class psychoanalysts. That's the main problem. How to endorse, to produce, to sustain psychoanalysts that become from working class. And today we have some experience in this kind of thing. They call it psychoanalysis on periphery. It's raising from suburbs, very poor areas around big cities in São Paulo or in Rio, and there are some foundations interested in financing this theoretical clinical training support. But we have questions around this. Who's going to pay for that, and who's going to influence this process? It's not only a question of how make people pay for the listening, for the treatment, as you can name it, but how to train working class psychoanalysts, because that's the main cutting point.
I think that's another aspect of the Red Clinic. One aspect is the clinical work itself, but another aspect of the Red Clinic is political education. So the Red Clinic has already organized online events The last one was with Palestinian psychotherapists talking about their practice in Palestine, which was talking through about how you work in that context. The Red Clinic has had a special meeting about the family. How do we think about the nature of the family today as something that is a kind of haven or an escape from this brutal capitalist world, but also as an apparatus that maintains and reproduces forms of authority? How do we think about these things politically? And that has consequences that links with how psychotherapists are training. And I think we need to be able to follow through some of the initiatives that are happening in Brazil and to build alternative forms of training that are also more accessible, also more immediately political. And again, there's a history to this. If you go back before the Second World War, for example, one of the main people who was funding Freud and the Freudian circles in Vienna before the Second World War was Max Eitingen. Max Eitingen was part of the inner circle with Freud, part of the so-called secret committee that wore special rings to indicate their allegiance to psychoanalysis and their allegiance to each other. And Max Eitingen,
Alfie should have rings.
he also funded the development of psychoanalysis in Palestine before the formation of the State of Israel, and also gave massive amounts of funding to the Palestine Communist Party. That is, there was a political project there as well as a psychoanalytic project. And although they didn't integrate the two all of the time, they were thinking about the social implications of doing therapeutic work. Very clear in Max Eitingen's commitment to building the Palestine Communist Party inside Palestine, as well as supporting psychoanalysis.
Do you think there's anything particularly left-wing about psychoanalysis? I'm finding that the whole idea of challenging your own thought and working through contradiction, this seems like intrinsically almost a socialist project. And in terms of something, having clients all over the political spectrum from, right to left, this seems to be one of the major themes that I've noticed in terms of recognition of self-contradiction is almost intrinsically leftist. Would you say so?
I think you're right. There's something about reflexive activity, which is necessarily leads you to the left. Okay, you're thinking critically, but I think it doesn't happen if you're thinking on your own as an individual. If you do it on your own as an individual, there's a kind of ideological support for the right in that activity. What we need to do is to make that reflexive activity into something that is collective. And that's why we learn from the activity in Brazil, because they're collective activities. They're groups of psychoanalysts working together and thinking through how they can work in poor communities. And that's why the Red Clinic is important, not simply as individual psychotherapists having their own sliding scale of charges, but working collectively and thinking collectively about what the role of psychoanalysis is. Then I think it takes it to the left.
Right.
Yeah, and we also have this kind of theoretical or methodological decision to incorporate all the critics, all the assimilations that psychoanalysis suffered in contact with radical critical tradition. For example, since the School of Frankfurt, from feminist studies, decolonial studies, anti-racist studies, gays and lesbian studies, and we can consider psychoanalysis as a discourse, as a theory, as a kind of a critical tendency, as this other post-Marxist or Marxist approaches. But our idea is how to change practice, since we've been criticized by so many authors, so many people since Freud and since wrote what they wrote. What we need is a practice of psychoanalysis informed, conceptually informed by his own critics.
Do you see a time where people will be able to call up the Red Clinic from anywhere and be like, I want a psychoanalyst and I want a socialist psychoanalyst. We're going to call up the Red Clinic. They'll help me out. Because I know a lot of people who enjoy the ability to do that.
Critical certificate.
I mean, I'm very connected in the online sphere to people interested in psychoanalysis who don't necessarily have immediate access, but with video therapy and such ease of education made possible by these kind of forums. I mean, I think it is possible to have like an international psychoanalytic clinic, both kind of present in wherever you are and also maybe even virtually. I don't know how the funding would work. If we can convert just one Elon, then we'll get it. But maybe you'll need a different way than that.
The way that it worked in Freud's time, in the Freud free clinics, was that the psychoanalytic organizations subsidized the free clinics, and that the individual psychoanalysts would write notes, kind of like special documents, that if they couldn't take on someone as a patient, they would write a kind of docket that would be a voucher that the patient would take to another psychoanalyst, and then they would be reimbursed. There was some kind of network of payment.
And tickets.
And that's what we're also thinking about now in the Red Clinic. But yes, I mean, ideally, it would be that someone would be able to contact the Red Clinic, that they would go through the right channels, and they would find a psychotherapist. Yes. Yeah. Now, the question is, does that mean that they would find a socialist psychoanalyst? I mean, you raise a very important issue there. If someone is wanting to go into psychoanalysis, for example, and they want a socialist psychoanalyst, I think they should be careful what they wish for, because they might discover that the socialist psychoanalyst isn't agreeing with them all the time and telling them what they want to hear, but that the socialist psychoanalyst is actually challenging them more effectively, because the socialist psychoanalyst knows something about the nature of politics and how important it is to keep politics out of the clinical space. I think that's an important issue that the Red Clinic is starting to think through now. How to keep the political project happening while keeping the clinic as a place for someone to speak, to say whatever comes to mind, to hear themselves speak and make connections between the different things that they say, without some analyst coming in and acting as a judge and telling them they should or shouldn't be saying this or that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that the tendency in psychoanalysis, which I would say is a conservative tendency in the social sphere, but it can be a radical tendency, is this kind of neutrality. And, I think in conservative politics, there's often the ground of this kind of pseudo neutrality. It's like, here's this kind of conservative position, but we're only saying this based out of objective principles. And this is like the very contradiction, I think, that any Red Clinic. I've actually given a stab at this, and I don't know if you know my name at all, but I tried writing a book called Zizek in the Clinic for Zero Books in 2019 and trying to apply Zizek to psychotherapy. And the idea was, it was not psychoanalysis, but it was like, how can you apply Zizek's theories into psychotherapy with ideology? And the thesis was essentially working through contradiction. This is like how I thought of it myself, but there's a million different ways you could cut that, of course, because one of the things that I've been thinking on ever since I tried that is like, is this a ground of pseudo neutrality? What is the role of the social sphere? And these are not so easy to figure out, right? The red, what is it?
I mean, you wouldn't want Zizek to be your analyst, would you? I mean,
he wouldn't want to be anyone's analyst. He's so neurotic. He would like be fearful. And also be bored.
I have to say that Zizek himself doesn't know much about the psychoanalytic clinic, so you don't want to take him as a guide.
No, I have a story. Zizek was in Brazil, and he was interviewed in a very popular television show. And one of my colleagues asked him, you in your clinic, how you do with those ideas? And he answered, look at me. You really can suppose that I am allowed to listen to someone and to help someone. I'm not a practice analyst and I'm a tuition and so on. It's a wonderful answer.
Yeah. I mean,
I think the question about neutrality and fake neutrality is a really important one, because many psychoanalysts imagine that they're neutral and they try and keep away from politics, but because they don't know anything about politics except the dominant ideology, they actually are not neutral. They bring their own politics into the clinic without being aware of it. So in order to be properly neutral in the clinic, you need to have a detailed political conceptual understanding of the nature of ideology and politics, so that you know what you're leaving at the clinic door, what you're leaving outside the clinic.
Yeah, I mean, I was precisely thinking something like that when I asked, is there a psychoanalytic right? Because I was thinking, well, there's certainly a tradition which claims to be apolitical, and that this is one of the enemies as well, this assumption that it's possible to escape politics in this way. So you've maybe got that's I think you've answered that, but what I wanted to ask was well, one of the things you've done, and one interesting thing you've written recently, Ian, was actually about the strikes which took place in Manchester. Well, they took place across the UK in March for the UCU. We're obviously in the middle of strikes right now with the train strikes across the country that the mainstream media keeps complaining about. And actually your article on the strikes uses the Red Clinic as a kind of framework for thinking about political struggle and what radical therapy might look like. So I think this is something worth talking about, because it's where you're actually addressing a directly a political thing that's taking place and arguing for the relevance of radical therapy in thinking through something like a series of strikes. So is this how does this work? It's also it's also a tool for thinking outside the clinic. Perhaps.
I mean, the article was about the first meeting that we had about the Red Clinic in Manchester. So we had that in the context of a solidarity meeting with the UCU strike that was happening across the country, and that gives a particular context for having this discussion. That is, the people who are involved in struggle are starting to think about the link between political change and the change that they're part of themselves personally. And so it provides a better context for thinking about what a Red Clinic could be. That's basically what the article was about. And that was the first of a number of meetings that we've had in Manchester since then. We're having a meeting this afternoon to talk about the experience in Brazil, to think about how we can learn about that context. So it's all about the framing of what psychotherapy is. That's absolutely crucial. Not only conceptual framing, but the practical material framing in our activity as we're involved in struggle. I think that really makes a difference. I mean, I would say that because I'm a Marxist and I'm a materialist.
And this is why the Red Clinic, you say it wants to work with trade unions, social movements, things like that, to sort of embed it within this kind of history of, well, working class struggle, I guess. I mean, let's maybe go back to the quite mad example of these public Brazil. You mentioned something about that, like similar to this, that you sort of somehow see sometimes this coalesce or grow into a kind of social movement. Like, does this happen when people are doing this public psychoanalysis, do other people sit and listen and then, use this as a sort of a jumping off point for debate and discussion? Do you see this like organically creating a commons? I guess I'm thinking of like a new kind of commons, a shared space, which is kind of pushed by psychoanalysis, but actually becomes this new form of social movement.
There are many kinds of interventions. For example, in emergency events, when we have the location of some group of people with no land, with no houses, and so on, and then they articulate point interventions. But I would say there's a kind of reflection about producing a new kind of communality. In order to produce those experiences, we have to break out from the actual state of psychoanalytic communities. They functions like condominiums. They functions like into wall discourse and into bubble organization. So there's a movement to produce another kind of sociability. And that's, in some sense, is connected with some Lacanian's ideas. The first is to critique internal clinical situation as a situation without power. The more important articles of Lacan about clinic, like Direction de la Cure and the principle of power, puts power into the clinic relation, how it operates, alienation, identification, how to deal with transference, how to deal with intellectual things, and so on. And at the end, Lacan proposes a kind of new social bond named discourse of the analyst. The discourse of the analyst is not only in the clinic situation. It was previewed to operate, for example, in the school of psychoanalysis. But a school must not be concerned to some walls and a professor. A school's style of life. A school can happen at the streets. A school's style of a form of being. So, and both ways we connect with this idea of a new social bond. We don't know how it is. We don't know how it would be, but we are searching for that in and out. What is clinic? Clinic is defined by the consulting room. No, it's much more discourse, power, subjective experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's so yeah. I mean, yeah, but I think this is spot on. I mean, I hope it's. So how long? Let's have a bit of the history of this. Like this phenomenon is taking off. You'd say in Brazil. You said the last 5 years. So I just want to recontextualize this, as you mentioned before, and you contextualized it in the question of Bolsonaro's government. It's quite interesting that this has developed at the same time as the mainstream media and government has sort of pulled to the right. You've seen this kind of develop. And I wonder that's probably critical for thinking about this, the need for this kind of new kind of commons and new kind of social structures, right? Because they symptoms or sort of rebellions against what's happening in the broader political history of Brazil, would you say?
Yeah, it was going on before Bolsonaro. But when Bolsonaro starts with this discourse against gays, against Indian people, native people, it's something affected psychoanalysts in a surprised way. Happens a movement called Psychoanalysts for Democracy, It was one of the first social movements against Bolsonaro in power. But before that, we have many groups working, for example, the margin, clinical margin, working with the violence of states. Since dictatorship up to now, the police aggressions against poor people, and there's national net to study that, to connect this with the dictatorship, and to intervene in the suffering we have in this historical social condition. So this is one of the experience that would be accelerated by Bolsonaro's coup.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that Christian Dunker is one of the key people in building this movement. I first met Chris in 1999 in Caracas, and it was clear that there was a political context already for thinking about the progressive role of psychotherapy. And Chris, over the last 20 years, has been developing this and forming groups and involved in going into communities, involved in building organizations that can give some kind of grounding to this. But it, as he said, it goes back before Bolsonaro. We went to the World Social Forum in 2002, where there were interventions there by the psychological organizations, and they were talking about Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari, and they were very clearly positioning themselves on the left as part of the project to build an alternative under the first Lula government and the Workers' Party. So it has a history in Brazil, and we need a deeper, longer history to make this kind of thing possible. It's not something that we can build just like that by setting up a red clinic and telling people that there's going to be free psychotherapy. We've got to build the context for it, and that's going to be a long, hard struggle.
Christian, sorry, I have a question. Is it a matter of getting these movements to recognize this psychotherapy project, or is it about getting psychotherapists to somehow get into these movements via these ideas of mental health and and kind of offer their services? This is I think maybe the question for me, because I always feel like as a psychotherapist, I almost feel like the signifier of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis is like a very difficult signifier to in order to kind of like avoid this problem. I guess my thought has, maybe this is my ideological thought, that it's always kind of necessary, like Ian said, what not to do is like, well, we will offer mental health services and this kind of thing, and we won't make people think about it too much, and we just want to help people. But maybe I'm kind of wrong in my thinking there. Could you like maybe as a leader of this movement, maybe you're the right guy to ask this question.
the main idea is there's no leader in this movement.
Right. Sorry. As a someone who's worked at, we could do a Marxist version. As someone who's worked on this project for over decades,
we had lots of discussions about that, because people would say, no, this is not psychoanalysis, this is not the proper setting, no, you are not a psychoanalyst, you are a psychotherapist, and which kind of psychotherapist? And in this discussion sounds more and more colonized discussion, because the definition, exactly what the name of this, what is going on this experience, is less important than the experience itself. So, of course, we have to rethink epistemological consequences, the question of payment, the question of training, and lots of things, rebuild the geography between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and between psychoanalysis and the versions of psychoanalysis you have among the worlds. it's good in some sense to have this discussion reopened by the experience. We don't know. In some cases, we have experimental, well-established psychoanalysts going to the public space, and in other experience, we have young psychological students trying to extend their training and so on. This mixture is in some sense the core of the experience, because we operate together. For example, we made an expedition for Altamira in Pará, north of Brazil, in order to listen to people, ribeirinhos we call, the river population, which were dislocated by the building of a huge hydroelectric dam. And we went there, and we don't know how to connect people. And when we announced our presence to the social movements, the movements they are fighting against the building of this dam for years, they immediately started a kind of a net in between them. Oh, you need to talk to someone. No, I think that fellow is no good. Go there, and then we take canoes and we take boats in order to grasp those people and install in some way the idea that you can talk with someone, you can take care of yourself, you can demand mental health service from the state. And after that, we bring the stories, we produce clinical cases, we share with these clinical cases with a journalist, which is doing a book which is going to be distributed to this population in order to make history, in order to say this suffering you have passed isn't only a private intimacy experience. You have to have this as a kind of a symbolic patrimony of this community. So the book as a way to get back, to turn, to give back something to this community and interfere in this repetition, because this city suffer this kind of intervention from state for 70 years.
I mean, maybe we could finish by talking about this question of internationalism, which I guess is at the heart of it, and it's related to what I think is to what you've just said. That why the international aspect of this is so critical. Why you're now collaborating. You know, you're in Manchester collaborating with the Red Clinic now, and so on. But is it partly, of course, it's the sharing of knowledge and so on, and the sharing of these histories. There's that point. But is it also about the political side of it, like perceiving patterns, you know, that there are like Brazil, the political context of Brazil is not totally separate from the political context of here. So is part of this internationalism more about, rather than sharing psychoanalytic practices, I suppose, is it about understanding the political context and the internationalism of the political moments? Or is it more about just there seems to be like a slight difference here, like what on the one hand it's sharing psychoanalytic practices and histories, but on the other hand there's something else going on, right, which is a connection of kind of, I don't know, workers across the world.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it goes again to the history of psychoanalysis. If you look at Freud's activity right from the beginning, he was in correspondence with people in different countries, extending from Europe out to Asia, around the world to South Africa, corresponding to Brazil, to build psychoanalysis as an international network. Psychoanalysis is intrinsically international and internationalist. And that's something that we're building on in the Red Clinic. And there's something about the globalization of psychotherapy as well here, that with the malign globalization of capitalism around the world, we have a globalization of a consciousness, of forms of resistance, of forms of activity in which workers come together and see their common cause from their different contexts and learn from those contexts. And that alternative globalization needs to connect with the internationalist aspect of the working class inside every country. So you don't have to go outside Britain, for example. You don't have to go outside Manchester to be internationalist. All you have to do is go into the city centre and hear the different languages that are being spoken by immigrants, by refugees, by asylum seekers. It is the internationalism is there in our practice and in our lives. And so to be authentically psychoanalytic and to listen to people and work with people, we need to be internationalist as well. International in our solidarity and international in our listening in every specific clinic.
I think that's a great. I'll go ahead, Chris. Yeah,
I would say internationalism is a kind of a cure, as a kind of an antidote to the reification of this commonality. When you produce a local commonality, it induces some kind of reification of identities, reification of suffering ways of narratives and symptoms and so on. So internationalization is a kind of a dismantling device against closing again in a newer community, the community of the critical psychoanalysts and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point, and in a way, it was almost a weirdly hopeful end, because in those, as you say, the malign globalization of capitalism, as you put it, Ian, there is in fact here a radical potential to find to operate against that by tapping into this global consciousness that becomes possible in this global society, and to sort of produce new forms of solidarity. So it's almost like this globalization of capitalism accidentally makes possible a rebellion against it, an international rebellion against it, I suppose.
Capitalism creates its own gravedigger. Marx said it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great point to leave it on. And where can people find out more about these projects? They can go to redclinic.org. I think that's correct, isn't it, for information about that? Anything else that people should look at?
Start there.
Well, listen, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing sort of how it goes. Perhaps in some couple of years we can check back in and discuss how it's been progressing. All right, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for listening.
Bye.